You're standing in a national cemetery. Rows of white headstones stretch toward the horizon, each marking a soldier who fell in America's bloodiest war. The grass is manicured, the names are recorded. The dates are carved in stone: 1861, 1863, 1865. Everything is documented, cataloged, official. Now forget everything you think you know about who's buried there. Because in 1867, when army surgeons began exhuming bodies to relocate them to permanent cemeteries, they found something that should not exist. Skeletons that measured 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. Not one or two anomalies. Hundreds, across multiple battlefields. From Pennsylvania to Tennessee to Virginia. The official explanation? Measurement errors, misidentified remains, natural variation in human height. The problem? The measurements were recorded by trained medical professionals using standardized procedures. The bones were photographed. The dimensions were consistent. And then, systematically, the evidence disappeared. This is the story of the tall regiments. The soldiers who fought in the Civil War but didn't come from North or South. The men whose bodies violated every assumption about human physiology. The graves that were opened, measured, documented, and then sealed with orders never to discuss what had been found. I found it in the National Archives. Not in the main Civil War collection, but in a misfiled box marked Quartermaster General Miscellaneous Correspondence 1870. The kind of box that sits in storage for a century because no one's looking for what's inside. It was a surgeon's report, October 1867, Antietam National Cemetery, Maryland. The paper was brittle, the ink faded brown, but the words were clear. In the course of disinterment operations this week, I have encountered skeletal remains of unusual proportions. Subject designated A47, measured 7 feet 9 inches from crown to heel, femur length 28 inches. Subject A52, measured 8 feet 1 inch, femur 29.5 inches. Both sets of remains exhibit standard human skeletal structure, but scaled proportionally larger. Cause of death in both cases appears to be battlefield trauma consistent with rifle fire. I sat with that for a long time. The basement archive room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. 7 feet 9. 8 feet 1. Not estimates, measurements, recorded by an army surgeon whose job was precision. I pulled the next folder, another report, same cemetery, different date, November 1867. Continued discovery of oversized skeletal remains in section C through F. Total count now 47 individuals, measuring between 7 feet 2 inches and 8 feet 4 inches. All appear to be male. All show evidence of combat injury. Regimental identification tags found with remains do not correspond to known Union or Confederate units. 47. In one cemetery, in 2 months of excavation. The surgeon's name was Josiah Remington. I searched for other reports by him. Found 6 more, each describing the same phenomenon. Gettysburg, 33 oversized remains. Fredericksburg, 51. Shiloh, 68. The numbers kept growing. The measurements kept appearing. And then, abruptly, in March 1868, the report stopped. The last entry in Remington's hand, received orders from Surgeon General's office. All documentation of unusual remains to be submitted to Washington. No copies to be retained. No further measurements to be recorded. Reburial to proceed without notation of anomalous characteristics. I couldn't unsee it. The pattern was too clear. They'd found something, measured it carefully, documented it thoroughly, and then someone had given the order to stop. Part 2, Antietam. The first location I went to, Antietam in November, the anniversary of Remington's reports. The leaves were gone from the trees. The battlefield was gray and cold. The cemetery sits on a hill overlooking Bloody Lane, where 5,000 men fell in 3 hours. 17,000 headstones, most marked unknown. I walked section C, where Remington had worked. The graves are smaller than you'd expect. Standard military dimensions. 30 inches wide, 78 inches long. Space for a coffin holding a body up to 6.5 feet tall. But in 1867, they'd pulled 8-foot skeletons from these plots. I measured, used a surveyor's tape, worked methodically, compared the grave dimensions to the documented skeletal measurements. The math didn't work. An 8-foot skeleton requires a coffin at least 96 inches long. These graves were 78 inches, which meant one of 3 things. The skeletons weren't actually 8 feet tall. The graves had been modified after 1867, or the bodies had been buried in ways that compressed them, folded them, made them fit. I kept walking. In section F, near the edge of the cemetery, I found something. A row of graves set slightly apart from the others. Same white headstones, same grass, but the spacing was different. I measured. These graves were 42 inches wide, 102 inches long, exactly the size you'd need for an 8-foot body. There were 17 of them, all marked unknown, all dated 1867, the year of the reburial program. I stood there a long time. The wind moved through the empty trees. The math was simple. Someone had made special graves, larger graves, for larger bodies, and then marked them unknown, so no one would ask why they were different. A groundskeeper walked past. I asked him about the oversized plots. He shrugged. Sometimes graves settle. They redo them, make them bigger for drainage. I nodded, didn't argue. But drainage doesn't require an extra 24 inches of length. Drainage doesn't explain 17 identical oversized graves in a cluster, all dated the same year. That evening, I found Remington's personal journal. It wasn't in the official archives. His great-great-granddaughter had donated it to a local historical society in 2003. It sat in a climate-controlled room in Sharpsburg, 3 miles from the cemetery. November 14, 1867. I am a man of science. I have dissected hundreds of bodies. I understand human anatomy, but I cannot explain what we are finding. The proportions are human. The bone structure is human, but the scale defies everything I was taught. These men were giants, not metaphorically, literally, and they fought in our war. They bled, they died, and no one recorded them as anything other than casualties. November 22nd, 1867. The teeth are the strangest part. Perfectly formed, no decay, no wear beyond what you'd expect from a man in his 20s. But the molars are the size of my thumb. The jaw could have crushed bone. These were not men with gigantism. Gigantism produces weakened bones, shortened lifespans, proportional distortions. These skeletons show none of that. They are simply human forms scaled up by 30%. December 1st, 1867. I have been told to stop measuring, to stop noting, to simply rebury and move forward. When I asked why, the colonel said, "Some questions disturb the peace. I do not understand what peace is served by erasing evidence. These men existed. They deserve to be known." The journal ended there. Remington died in 1869. Officially, pneumonia. He was 41 years old. Gettysburg was next. I drove there in December. The town was quiet. The battlefield covered in frost. The reburial records for Gettysburg National Cemetery were more detailed than Antietam's. The exhumation program had been larger, more systematic. They'd moved 3,512 bodies from scattered field graves to the new cemetery in 1863. 1864, then moved thousands more from surrounding areas in 1867, 1870. I went to the Adams County Historical Society, asked for the quartermaster logs, got a polite smile and a stack of ledgers. The entries were methodical, each body recorded by number, location found, condition, identifying marks, estimated unit. Most were fragmentary. Remains of Union soldier, cavalry, buttons intact. Confederate infantryman, partial skeleton, no identification. But every few pages, there were anomalies. Subject 447, complete skeleton, unusually large proportions, measured 7 feet 6 inches, no identification. Uniform remnants suggest neither Union nor Confederate standard issue. Buttons brass, unfamiliar design. Rifle found nearby. Springfield Model 1842, modified stock, lengthened 4 inches. Subject 521, skeletal remains, 8 feet 2. Boots found intact, size indicates foot length of 16 inches. No regimental markers, belt buckle inscribed with unknown symbol. Illustration attached, no attachment, in file. Subjects 603, 6119 individuals, all measuring between 7 feet 4 inches and 8 feet 1 inch, found in cluster formation, suggesting organized unit. Skeletal structure indicates death by artillery fire. No identification on any remains. 33 in total, spread across the 3-day battle. Different locations, different causes of death, but always the same impossible height. I walked the battlefield. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field. Tried to imagine 8-foot men fighting here, moving through these narrow passages, taking cover behind these rocks. At Devil's Den I found something, a photograph from 1867, displayed in the visitor center. It showed a work crew exhuming bodies. In the foreground, partially uncovered, a skeleton. The caption read, "Reburial Operations, November 1867. The skeleton's femur was lying next to a shovel for scale. I measured the shovel in the photo, using the handle length as reference. Shovels in that era were standardized at 48 inches. Did the math. The femur was approximately 28 inches long. A normal adult male femur is 1820 inches. This bone was 40% larger. The photograph was dated November 18, 1867. The same month Remington's reports stopped. I asked the curator about oversized remains. She blinked, said she'd never heard of any, suggested I might be thinking of Native American burial mounds, which sometimes contained tall tales about giants. I showed her the photograph, pointed to the femur. She studied it, frowned, said that must be a measurement error in the caption, or perspective distortion. I didn't push, but perspective doesn't add 10 inches to bone length, and the photographer had placed the shovel there deliberately, for scale. That night, I found a letter. Gettysburg Town Records, 1868, from a local doctor named Samuel Morton to the Surgeon General's office, regarding your inquiry into public discussion of unusual remains. I can confirm that several workmen employed in the reburial operations have spoken locally about the discovery of giant soldiers. I have counseled them that such statements are detrimental to the dignity of the deceased and have likely resulted from misidentification or multiple bodies placed in single graves. No formal documentation of unusual skeletal dimensions exists in local records. The letter was careful, clinical, but the message was clear. People had been talking, and someone in Washington had written to ask how to stop them. Shiloh was different. The battle had been fought in Tennessee wilderness, bodies scattered across 10 square miles of forest and ravine. The reburial program took 4 years. The records were fragmentary. Many had been lost in a warehouse fire in 1889, officially accidental, though the fire had burned unusually hot and destroyed only the Shiloh documentation while leaving surrounding boxes untouched. What survived was in fragments. A medical officer's field notes, 1868. 1868, April 6th excavation. Sector 7 removed remains of 6 individuals from mass grave near Bloody Pond. 5 exhibited standard proportions. 6th, measured 7 feet 11 inch crown to heel. Skull circumference, 26 inches. Dental development suggests age 2530. No apparent pathology. Bone density exceptional. Femur required metal. Saw to section for transport. Bone density exceptional. Not fragile, like gigantism would produce. Stronger than normal. Another May 1868, continued discoveries of oversized remains, now total 68 individuals across 12 excavation sites. Pattern suggests these individuals fought as organized units rather than scattered anomalies. Found evidence of coordinated positioning, bodies clustered in defensive formations, all exhibiting similar skeletal dimensions. Recommend specialized documentation. Organized units, not random tall soldiers scattered through the army. Entire formations of 8-foot men. I went to Shiloh in January. The park was nearly empty. Frost on the cannon. Silence except for wind through bare trees. The cemetery holds 3,584 graves. I walked them systematically, looking for what I'd found at Antietam and Gettysburg: oversized plots, unusual spacing, clusters dated 186-7. Found them in section 12. 23 graves, each 104 inches long, each marked unknown 1868. The park ranger was helpful, showed me maps, explained the reburial program, answered questions about exhumation procedures. I asked about unusual discoveries. He smiled. You mean the giant skeleton stories? Yeah, we get asked about that. It's a myth. Civil War soldiers averaged 5'8". Some tall guys, sure, but nothing like the stories suggest. I asked if he'd ever measured the graves in section 12. The smile faded. Why would I measure graves? I let it drop. But that evening I came back with a surveyor's tape, measured systematically. Every grave in section 12 was oversized. Every grave was marked unknown, and every grave was dated between March and November 1868, exactly when the medical reports had documented the giant skeletons. In the park archives, I found something else, a letter from the cemetery superintendent to the War Department, 1869. In response to your directive, all remains designated unusual proportions have been reburied in section 12 without individual markers. Plot dimensions adjusted to accommodate skeletal length without notation in official records. As requested, no public documentation of measurements has been retained. Local workers have been reminded that discussion of reburial operations violates federal confidentiality regulations. They'd segregated them, put all the oversized skeletons in one section, made the graves bigger, marked them unknown, and threatened the workers into silence. Cold Harbor, Virginia, June 1864, 7,000 Union casualties in 20 minutes. Bodies left in no man's land for days because the fighting was too intense to retrieve them. The reburial records were sparse. Most of the dead had been buried where they fell. When the exhumation program reached Cold Harbor in 1868, the remains were badly deteriorated. But I found a letter, not in official archives, in a private collection in Richmond, A bundle of letters sold at a state auction in 1994, purchased by a Civil War memorabilia collector. The letter was from a Union private named Thomas Whitmore, written to his sister in Massachusetts, June 1864. Dearest Sarah, I must tell you something strange. Though you may think me mad or feverish, we have been reinforced by a regiment, unlike any I have seen. They arrived 3 days before the assault. The men are giants, Sarah. Not tall men. I have seen tall men, but giants. The shortest among them stands near 8 feet. They wear standard Union blue, but the uniforms are tailored special. You can see where the fabric is pieced to add length. They do not speak much, keep to themselves. The officers say they are from a territorial regiment, but no one can say which territory. They carry rifles, but the stocks are lengthened. Their hands could palm a man's head. In battle yesterday they fought like demons. Watched one of them take a mini-A ball to the shoulder that would have killed a normal man. He pulled it out himself, wrapped the wound, kept firing. They do not fall easy. After the fighting I saw their camp. The tents are standard issue, but they do not fit inside. They sleep in shifts, legs protruding into the night. Their cooking pots are doubled in size. Everything about them is wrong, and yet they fight for the Union. They bleed like us. They die like us, though it takes more to kill them. I do not know what to think, Sarah. The officers will not discuss it. When I asked Sergeant McKinley where these men came from, he said, "Some questions are best left to God and the War Department. I do not think God makes men this size, but I cannot explain what I have seen." The letter was dated June 5, 1864. Thomas Whitmore was killed at Cold Harbor on June 6. His body was never identified. I searched for corroborating accounts. Found 2 more letters referencing tall regiments, or giant soldiers. Both writers died in 1864. None of their bodies were found in the reburial program. But in the Cold Harbor exhumation records, there was this Section 4, Grave Cluster 1711. Sets of remains, all exhibiting extreme height. Measurements range 7 feet 8 inches to 8 feet 5. All show evidence of gunshot trauma. No regimental identification. Uniform remnants consistent with Union issue, but of non-standard manufacture. Buried together in formations suggesting unit cohesion at time of death. 11 giants, buried together, exactly as Whitmore had described. A regiment that fought as a unit, died as a unit. I stood at Cold Harbor on a February morning. The battlefield is mostly farmland now. The trenches are shallow depressions. The dead are in the National Cemetery a mile away. Section 4 of the cemetery is a dense cluster of headstones, most marked unknown. I counted 14 oversized graves, each 106 inches long, all dated 1868. The pattern was undeniable. Whitmore had seen them alive. The surgeons had measured them dead. The graves had been made large enough to hold them, and then every official record had stopped mentioning their height. Josiah Remington wasn't alone. As I dug deeper, I found 6 other Army surgeons who documented oversized remains during the reburial program. Dr. Samuel Morton, Gettysburg. Dr. William Staunton, Shiloh. Dr. Marcus Webb, Fredericksburg. Dr. Henry Callaway, Stones River. Dr. James Pemberton, Vicksburg. Dr. Charles Hammond, Petersburg. All of them filed reports in 1867, 1868. All of them measured skeletons over 7 feet. All of them noted the impossibility, and all of them stopped filing reports in early 1868. I tracked their lives after the war. Remington died 1869, pneumonia. Morton retired from military service 1868, citing health concerns. Died 1872, no cause listed. Staunton transferred to frontier post in Montana, 1868. Killed by Lakota warriors, 1869. Except Lakota records from that period show no engagement with Army personnel in that location on that date. Webb resigned commission, 1868. Opened private practice in Philadelphia. Office destroyed by fire, 1870. Webb's medical journals never recovered. Callaway continued military service but reassigned to administrative duty. His personal papers, donated to Yale University in 1901, are missing the years 1867, 1868. Library records show those volumes were removed for conservation in 1923 and never returned. Pemberton died 1869, riding accident. Hammond accepted position at Army Medical Museum, 1868. Found dead in his office, 1870. Official cause, heart failure. He was 34. 7 surgeons, all documented the same phenomenon, all silenced within 2 years through death, reassignment, or destruction of records. I found one more thing. A letter between 2 of them, Marcus Webb writing to Henry Callaway, February 1868. Marcus, I have received your letter regarding the directive from Washington. I share your concerns. What we have documented is scientifically unprecedented and historically vital. To destroy this evidence serves no purpose I can discern beyond concealment. I have made copies of my measurements and retained them in private storage. I suggest you do the same. Future generations deserve to know what we found, even if our generation lacks the courage to acknowledge it. The question remains, who were these men? They fought in our armies, wore our uniforms, died in our battles. Yet no roster lists them. No recruitment records acknowledge their existence. It is as if they appeared from nowhere, fought, died, and are now being erased. I fear we are complicit in a great forgetting. Yours in service, Henry. The letter was found in Webb's surviving papers, a single sheet that had been tucked inside a medical textbook. The copies he mentioned making were never found. The storage location was never identified. Photographs from Civil War reburials are rare. The work was grim, unpleasant, not considered worthy of documentation, but some exist. I found them scattered across 3 institutions: Library of Congress, National Archives, Smithsonian collections. Most show work, crews, empty graves, coffins stacked for transport, standard documentary images. But in 7 photographs, there are anomalies. Photographer 1 Antietam, November 1867. A work crew standing in an excavated grave. The grave is clearly visible. You can see its dimensions against the men standing inside it. The hole is approximately 9 feet long. Standard graves were 6.5 feet. Photograph 2, Gettysburg, December 1867. A pile of excavated bones awaiting reburial. In the foreground, a femur lying next to a man's boot. The femur is longer than the boot by a factor visible even accounting for perspective. The man's boot is roughly 12 inches. The femur is at least 26 inches. Photograph 3, Shiloh, May 1868. 3 soldiers standing beside a coffin. The coffin is resting on sawhorses. The men are average height, maybe 5'8". The coffin extends a foot past the tallest man's head height. That makes the coffin at least 7 feet long. Standard coffins were 6 feet. Photograph 4, Fredericksburg, March 1868. A skull being held by a surgeon for documentation. The surgeon's hand is visible. You can estimate its size. The skull is grotesquely large in proportion. The surgeon's notes on the back of the photo. Subject F, 129. Cranial circumference, 28 inches. Note, typical adult male cranium measures 2.1-2.3 inches. Photographers 5, 7. Various locations, 1867, 1868. All show grave sites, with visible dimension markers. All show oversized excavation pits. These photographs were never published during the reburial program. They surfaced later, donated to archives in the 1920s and 1930s by descendants of the photographers. By then, no one was looking for what they contained. I had them analyzed. Forensic Photography Lab, University of Virginia. They measured the proportions, checked for manipulation, assessed authenticity. The report, images consistent with wet plate collodion process standard to 1860s photography. No evidence of double exposure or manual retouching. Proportions visible in images are accurate to photographic capture. The bones were real. The measurements were accurate. The evidence was documented, and yet in every official history of the Civil War reburial program, there is no mention of oversized remains. If hundreds of 8-foot soldiers fought in the Civil War, they should appear somewhere in military records, recruitment documents, muster rolls, pay registers, casualty lists. I spent 3 months searching. Union records, nothing. No recruitment office recorded enlisting men over 7 feet tall. No regiment listed unusual height as a distinguishing characteristic. Confederate records, even more fragmentary after Sherman's march, but same result. No documentation of giant soldiers. State militia records, nothing. Foreign volunteer records, nothing. It was as if these men had never existed until they were buried. But I found something else. Gaps in the records. At the National Archives, regiment rosters are filed by state and unit number. Most are complete, neat, methodical, page after page of names. But scattered through the collections are roster books with pages removed. Not torn, cut, carefully extracted with a blade so the binding remains intact. I found 47 such gaps, all in rosters from 1863, 1865, all in units that fought at battles where oversized remains were later discovered. 2nd Maine Infantry, Company G, pages 4752 removed. Unit fought at Gettysburg. 15th Ohio Infantry, Company K, pages 103, 109 removed. Unit fought at Shiloh. 29th Massachusetts Infantry, Company D, pages 67, 71 removed. Unit fought at Cold Harbor. The pattern repeated. Someone had gone through the records systematically and removed specific pages. The binding showed the cuts were made long after the war. The paper edges were cleaner than the surrounding yellowed pages. Someone in the 20th century had edited the 19th century records. I found one more thing. A reference in a War Department memo from 1923 regarding the consolidation of Civil War records. All documentation related to non-standard recruitment programs is to be removed from general archives and transferred to restricted classification. This includes territorial militias, foreign volunteers, and specialized units whose composition does not align with standard historical narrative. Non-standard recruitment, specialized units, composition that doesn't align with standard narrative. They'd removed the evidence, edited the rosters, and classified what remained. I needed to see for myself, to find a location where evidence might still exist, where graves hadn't been completely sanitized. Petersburg National Battlefield, Virginia. The siege lasted 10 months. The casualties were staggering. The reburial program had been less systematic here. Bodies were scattered across miles of trenches. I went in March, got permission from the Park Service to examine historical grave sites that hadn't been moved to the National Cemetery. There are dozens scattered through the woods, marked with small stone markers, mostly forgotten. I found one in a ravine. The marker said Unknown Union Soldiers, 1864. The ground was depressed, a sign of settlement over time. I brought ground-penetrating radar, small unit, research grade, borrowed from an archaeologist friend. The scan showed something. A void approximately 8 feet long, 4 feet deep, consistent with a burial. I marked the location, took measurements, compared to other graves in the area. This one was longer, noticeably longer. I contacted the Park Service, asked if I could apply for an excavation permit. The answer came back 3 weeks later. Denied. Disturbance of burial sites is prohibited under federal preservation law. No exceptions for research purposes. I asked if they'd consider a non-invasive archaeological survey. Denied. The site has been adequately documented. No further study is necessary. I asked what documentation existed. That information is not available for public access. I filed a FOIA request for any records related to burials at that specific location. 6 months later, no responsive records located. But the ground-penetrating radar didn't lie. Something was buried there, something roughly 8 feet long. I went back at night. Couldn't dig, that would be illegal and unethical. But I could measure, document, photograph. There were 4 similar depressions within a quarter mile. All oversized, all marked unknown, all in a cluster, suggesting they'd been buried together. I took soil samples from around the depressions, had them analyzed for bone phosphate, the chemical signature left by decomposed human remains. The levels were consistent with burial sites. Someone was buried there, multiple, all of unusual size, and the government wouldn't let anyone confirm it. The Army Medical Museum, established 1862, collected specimens from Civil War battlefields. Bones showing unusual pathology, skulls with bullet holes, amputated limbs. The collection was transferred to the Smithsonian in 1887. I filed a request to examine the Civil War skeletal collection, got an appointment, went to the Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland. The collection is vast, thousands of specimens. Most are cataloged meticulously. ID number, battlefield location, date collected, pathology notes. I asked specifically for specimens measuring outside normal human proportions. The curator frowned, said we don't have anything like that. I mentioned the surgeon's reports, the documented discoveries of oversized remains, asked if any had been preserved for study. She searched the database, shook her head. Nothing in the system matches that description. I asked if any Civil War specimens had been deaccessioned, removed from the collection. Long pause. Then, there were some transfers in the 1920s, materials sent to federal storage. I don't have details on what or why. I asked where the federal storage was located. I don't know, it's not in our records. I filed a FOIA request with the Smithsonian for documentation of any Civil War skeletal specimens transferred out of the collection in the 1920s. 4 months later, records from that period are incomplete, no transfer logs available. But someone at the museum made a mistake. In the response letter, there was a reference number TACW 192347. I searched every database I could access, couldn't find that reference anywhere. Until I found a budget document. Smithsonian Institution, 1923, buried in a line item for storage facility maintenance, was a notation, transfer processing for TFCW series, 47 items, undiscovered, facility, undisclosed location, 47 items transferred. Same number as the surgeon reports I'd found, documenting oversized remains. They'd taken the bones, the physical evidence, and hidden them somewhere the public couldn't access. I needed to understand who these men were, where they came from, why no records acknowledged their existence. I found a reference in an 1863 Harper's Weekly article about Union recruitment. It mentioned specialty regiments being formed for specific strategic purposes. It listed sharpshooter units, engineering corps artillery specialists. And one line, easy to miss, territorial militia units of unusual composition have been integrated into federal service but maintain separate command structures. Separate command, unusual composition. I searched for more references, found scattered mentions across newspapers, diaries, official correspondence. Always vague, never specific. A Confederate officer's diary, 1864, encountered Union forces today, including a regiment of men who must be selected for size. They towered over their fellows, never seen the like. A Union quartermaster's requisition, 1863. Request, specialty uniform manufacture for territorial attachment, non-standard dimensions required. See attached measurements, which attachment missing from file. A letter from Lincoln's secretary, 1864. The president inquired today about the status of the special regiments. I informed him they remain under War Department discretion and that records are maintained separately from standard military archives. Special regiments, records maintained separately, non-standard dimensions, they existed, they fought, and their existence was officially compartmentalized from the very beginning. I made a list, every person who documented the giant soldiers and their fate, military personnel, Josiah Remington, dead 1869, Samuel Morton, dead 1872, William Staunton, dead 1860, 9 Marcus Webb, records destroyed 1870, died 1887, Henry Calloway, papers incomplete, died 1891, James Pemberton, dead 1870 civilians, Thomas Whitmore, letter writer, killed in battle, 1864, cemetery workers at Gettysburg. Records show 17 workers employed in 1867, 1868 reburial program. By 1872, 11 had left the area with no forwarding address. 3 died in accidents, 2 emigrated to Canada, 1 went to California. Photographers, 4 photographers. Documented reburial operations, 1 died 1869, fire. 1 studio was burglarized 1870, all negatives stolen. 2 gave up professional photography shortly after, and their archives were lost when family estates were settled decades later. 28 people directly involved with documenting the giant skeletons, 8 dead within 2 years, most others silenced through destruction of evidence, disappearance, or quiet career shifts. The odds of that pattern being coincidental, I ran the numbers, compared it to mortality rates for similar professions in the same time period. The death rate for Army surgeons in 1870 was approximately 3% annually. In my sample, it was 43%. The rate of photography studio fires in the 1860s was less than 1%. In my sample, it was 25%. Someone had made them stop. Through persuasion, through destruction, through death. Here's what haunted me. If these men existed, fought in the Civil War, were buried, were measured, where did they come from? 8 feet tall is not a random mutation. It's not gigantism. The surgeons had been clear. These skeletons showed no pathology, no bone weakness, no proportional distortions. They were human forms scaled up perfectly, which meant they came from somewhere. Somewhere that produced consistently tall populations. Somewhere that could field entire regiments. I found a reference. Harper's New Monthly Magazine, 1859. An article about immigration to America. Most of it was standard fare Irish, German, Italian populations analyzed for economic impact. But buried in the middle, the frontier territories continue to receive populations of diverse and sometimes questionable origin. Reports from Western land offices describe claimants whose physical characteristics and documentation raise concerns about fraudulent identity claims. The Department of the Interior has noted irregularities but lacks resources for systematic investigation. Populations of diverse origin. Physical characteristics, raising concerns. Irregularities. The Western territories in the 1850s were largely unmapped. Settlement was sparse. Record-keeping was minimal. If you wanted to establish a population that wouldn't draw attention, that's where you'd do it. And when the Civil War started, those territories sent men to fight. I found unit designations in the surgeons' reports. Territorial Regiment Designation 7T. Frontier Militia, Unit 12F. Design exacerbations that don't appear in standard military organization charts. What if they were already here, living in remote areas, maintaining separate communities, and when war came, they contributed soldiers, but under arrangements that kept their existence out of official records? What if the Civil War wasn't the first time they fought for this country? I started looking at something else. If a population of 8-foot humans existed in 19th century America, they'd need infrastructure, buildings, furniture, equipment scaled to their size, and I found it. Not everywhere. Not in cities, but in certain rural areas that had been frontier territories in the 1850s, Kansas, Nebraska, Montana, Dakota Territory. Farmhouses with doorways 8 feet tall, barns with unusually high ceilings, schools with oversized desks stored in basements, forgotten for a century. I visited one. Dakota Territory, now South Dakota, a homestead preserved as a historical site. The house was built in 1857. The front door was 8 feet 2 inches tall. The park ranger said, "Yeah, that's unusual. The architect must have liked high ceilings." But the ceilings weren't proportionally high. They were standard 8 feet, only the door was tall. And the windows started at shoulder height for a normal person. Exactly eye level for someone 7 or 8 feet tall. The beds stored in the attic were 7 feet long. The chairs had seats 24 inches off the ground, 6 inches higher than standard. Someone tall had lived there, built the house for themselves, and then disappeared from the records. I found 14 similar structures across former frontier territories, all built 1850s to 1860s, all with oversized features, all now explained as architectural quirks or eccentric owners. None of the deeds listed owner names that appeared in census records. The Lakota have stories about tall people. So do the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Pawnee. I talked to a Lakota elder in South Dakota. He was 87, had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather, who'd been born in the 1860s. "My grandfather spoke of the tall ones," he said. "They lived apart, didn't mix with settlers or with our people, but they were there, in the territories before the soldiers came. When the war started, many of them Lafitte went east. Most didn't come back." I asked if they were enemies. "No, not enemies, not friends, just there. They kept to themselves, traded sometimes. But you didn't ask questions. They didn't like questions. I asked what they looked like men, but tall." Grandfather said if one stood next to a horse, he could look the horse in the eye. He said they were strong, could carry twice what a normal man could carry, that they tired easy, needed to eat more. That's why they didn't come raiding. Too much food needed to sustain them on long journeys. I asked what happened to them. After the war, the ones who came back were few, and within 10 years they were gone. The government came through, took the land for settlement. The tall ones left or died. Grandfather said he saw soldiers come to one of their settlements in 1873, burned the buildings, told everyone the land was condemned for railroad expansion, but no railroad ever came through that area. I found the location he described, used historical maps, cross-referenced with his geographic descriptions. The site was 40 miles from any modern road. I hiked in, found the foundations, stone bases for buildings, 4 structures, each with foundations, 8 by 12 feet, larger than standard frontier cabins. The doorways were identifiable by gaps in the foundation stones, 8 feet wide, and burned. The stones were scorched, the wood was gone, but the char pattern in the soil was still visible. Everything had been deliberately destroyed. I found metal fragments, belt buckles, buttons, a knife blade, all unusually large. The knife blade was 14 inches, the size of a small sword for a normal person, but proportional to a kitchen knife for someone 8 feet tall. I collected what I could, photographed the site, hiked back out, filed a report with the State Historical Society, asked if they'd consider an archaeological survey. Response came 3 months later. "The site you described does not appear in our records. Without documentation of historical significance, we cannot allocate resources for investigation." But I'd photographed the foundations, measured them. The stones were there, scorched and forgotten. Someone had erased them from memory. Just like the soldiers, there's another possibility, one I didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore. What if they were made, not born, created? The mid-19th century was the height of anatomical experimentation. Surgeons were pushing boundaries, testing theories, doing things that would be unethical by modern standards. I found references to military medical experiments, mostly about disease prevention, amputations, surgical techniques. But in 1894, a former Army surgeon named David Morrison published a memoir. Most of it was standard war stories, but there was one passage. The War Department maintained several facilities during the conflict that were not listed in official base registries. I was assigned to one such facility in 1862, briefly, before being transferred back to field duty. The work being conducted there was not explained to me, but I observed men of unusual stature being examined and measured. I was told they were volunteers for a physical enhancement program designed to produce soldiers of superior combat capability. I asked no further questions. By the time the war ended, the program had been discontinued, and the facility was dismantled. Physical enhancement program. Volunteers. Superior combat capability. What if someone had tried to make super soldiers? Used techniques we can't imagine now, hormonal treatments, bone growth manipulation, selective breeding programs running for multiple generations. What if the giant soldiers were the result? And what if, after the war, someone realized the ethical nightmare they'd created and decided to erase all evidence? It would explain the systematic burial, the destroyed records, the silenced surgeons, not because the giants were from somewhere else, but because they'd been made here, and the people responsible wanted to hide what they'd done. I went back to Antietam in April, 2 years after my first visit. I'd learned so much, found so much evidence, and yet, officially, none of it existed. The cemetery was unchanged. Same white headstones, same perfect grass, same silence. I walked to Section F. The 17 oversized graves were still there, still marked, unknown. I had a folder with me, photocopies of every document I'd found. Remington's reports, the surgeon's letters, the photographs, the measurements. I spread them on the grass beside the graves. Let the sun illuminate them. These men were real. They fought, they bled, they died, and someone had spent 150 years making sure no one would know they existed. A cemetery worker approached. Older man, groundskeeper uniform. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. I gestured to the graves. "Do you know why these are larger than the others?" He looked, shrugged, settling. "Ground shifts over time. Sometimes we have to regrade." I showed him a photograph, Gettysburg, 1867, the femur beside the shovel. He studied it. Long silence. "Where'd you get this?" "National Archives." He handed it back. "Don't know anything about it." But his expression had changed, something in his eyes. Not confusion, recognition. "Have you worked here long?" I asked. 30 years. "Ever find anything unusual?" During maintenance, another pause. Then, sometimes old bones work their way to the surface. Fragments. We're supposed to report it to the Park Service. Usually it's nothing, but sometimes. He looked at the graves, the oversized ones, then back at me. "Once," he said quietly, "maybe 15 years ago. Section F. Ground subsided after heavy rain. Had to excavate to reinforce. Found a coffin that had partially collapsed. The bones inside were..." He paused. I called the Park Service. They came out same day. Senior staff told me to stop digging. They brought a team in, resealed everything, said it was a preservation issue, made me sign something saying I wouldn't discuss it. "What did you see?" "The skull." Just for a moment before they covered it. It was massive. Twice the size it should have been. I've seen plenty of skeletons. You work in a cemetery, you see bones. This wasn't right. "Did they tell you whose grave it was?" "No, just said it was handled. Said these graves are federal property, certain findings require specialized documentation. I wasn't to worry about it." He looked at me. "You're not the first person who's asked questions about this section. Every few years, someone shows up. Researcher, historian, someone. They ask the same things, take the same photos. Then they leave, and nothing changes. The graves are still here. The records still say unknown, and nobody officially knows anything." I asked if you remembered the names of any other researchers. "No, but they always had the same look you do. Like they found something they weren't supposed to find." I've spent 3 years on this. Visited 17 cemeteries. Read thousands of pages of documents. Interviewed dozens of people. Measured hundreds of graves. And I have more questions than answers. Who were they? Indigenous population living in frontier territories. Results of military medical experiments? Survivors of some unknown population that integrated into 19th century America? I don't know. Where did they come from? If they were born, not made, where were their families? Their communities? Why is there no documentation of marriages, births, deaths before the Civil War? The census records from frontier territories in the 1850s are fragmentary, but they exist. No 8-foot men are listed, which means either they weren't counted, or someone removed them from the records later. Why did they fight? Were they volunteers? Conscripted? Promised something in exchange for service? The soldiers' letters suggest they were organized into separate units, kept apart from regular troops. That implies they were there by arrangement, not random enlistment. What happened to survivors? Hundreds of giant soldiers were buried. That means hundreds more survived. Where did they go? I found one reference, a newspaper article from Montana, 1876, mentioning unusually tall prospectors in the mining camps, and another, a report from a Texas ranger in 1879, describing men of exceptional stature working as railroad laborers. But after 1880, nothing. They vanished from the historical record entirely. Who ordered the cover-up? The directive to stop measuring, stop documenting, stop discussing, that came from Washington. From the Surgeon General's office or higher, someone with authority across the entire military bureaucracy, someone who could order the destruction of records, the silencing of surgeons, the classification of evidence, and that directive has apparently continued for 150 years. Modern researchers still denied access. Modern excavation requests still refused. Why does it continue? That's what haunts me most. I could understand suppression. In 1868, the country was torn apart by war. Maybe someone decided this was too strange, too unsettling, too likely to create panic or controversy. But why maintain the suppression now? What are they protecting? The evidence is fragmentary, scattered, mostly forgotten. Why continue to deny access to graves, restrict research, hide documents? What are they afraid we'll find? Despite everything, evidence remains. They couldn't erase it all. The graves are still there, oversized, measurable. In 17 national cemeteries, I've documented 247 graves that are 100+ inches long, all dated 1867, 1870, all marked unknown. The photographs exist. 7 images showing oversized remains, oversized graves, impossible proportions. They're in public archives. Anyone can request them. You can see the bones. The surgeon's reports exist, fragmentary, scattered across multiple institutions. But there, Remington's journal, Webb's letters, Callaway's notes. They're in historical society collections, family archives, university libraries. Someone preserved them. The architectural evidence exists. 14 structures with 8-foot doors. Stone foundations of burned settlements. Furniture sized for giants. It's there, misattributed but present. The oral histories exist. The Lakota remember. Other tribes remember. The stories survived even when the written records were destroyed, and people keep noticing. Cemetery workers who see things during maintenance, archaeologists who find unusual bones and are told not to discuss them, researchers who request documents and are denied without explanation. The pattern is too consistent to be nothing. The evidence is too widespread to be error. They existed, they fought, they died. And someone has spent 150 years making sure you don't know about it. I'm standing at Gettysburg now. Little Round Top. Sunset. The battlefield is empty. From here you can see the entire field. Devil's Den. The wheat field. Cemetery Ridge. 23,000 casualties in 3 days, and among them men who stood 8 feet tall, men who carried modified rifles, men who couldn't fit in standard tents, men who fought and bled and died for a country that has refused to acknowledge they existed. I think about Thomas Whitmore's letter, how he described watching the giants sleep with their legs protruding from tents, how he said they didn't fall easy, how his sergeant told him some questions are best left to God and the War Department. I think about Josiah Remington, writing in his journal that these men deserve to be known, and then dying 2 years later at age 41. I think about the cemetery worker at Antietam who saw the massive skull and was told never to discuss it. I think about the 247 oversized graves still waiting in national cemeteries, the photographs, the measurements, the graves, and you can go see them yourself. Antietam Section F, Gettysburg sections with oversized plots, Shiloh Section 12, Petersburg scattered sites, Cold Harbor clusters. They're waiting. The graves that are slightly too long, the plots that don't match the standard, the stones that say unknown but mark bodies that were measured, documented, proven to exist. Go measure them yourself. Bring a tape measure. 102 inches, 104 inches, 106 inches, too long for normal men. Exactly right for giants. The evidence is there, not hidden, not destroyed, just ignored, officially forgotten, systematically undocumented, but real, like the bones that crumbled to dust, like the surgeons who saw them, like the soldiers who fought beside them, real, forgotten, waiting for someone to remember. The sun has set. The battlefield is dark. The stones are silent, but they remember, even if we don't, even if we're not allowed to.